Welcome back. Now, earlier we spoke to the ANC's head of economic transformation, Enoch Godongwana, on the party's paper called the Reconstruction, Growth and Transformation of Building a New Inclusive Economy. Now, the paper proposes, amongst others, a revitalisation of the economy. It makes suggestions for creating jobs to stimulate the country's economic growth. So, to achieve this, the ANC proposes, amongst others, changes to Regulation 28 of the Pension Funds Act to enable access to the money to finance these economic growth proposals. Khaya Sithole is an analyst and chartered accountant who joins us now to discuss this. Khaya, thanks so much for your time.
Good morning, and good morning to the viewers.
Let's start with that proposal on changes to the Regulation 28 of the Pension Funds Act, Khaya. This, of course, to enable access to the funds to finance these economic growth proposals. So, given the challenges that we already have regarding corruption in this country, what guarantees do we have that the money would be going to good investments?
Well, there are simply no guarantees, and I think we need to be able to explain exactly what Regulation 28 is all about. So what happens is that when you and I are busy saving for a life of retirement through the pension system that we have in the country, the people that manage those finances cannot just randomly decide to take your money and invest it in their own preferred asset without following particular guidelines. So what Regulation 28 it seeks to identify what we refer to as investable asset classes, which is essentially places where your money may be invested. And then also it then sets particular limits on how much can be put in any particular asset class. The reason that is important is that, of course, if your fund manager particularly likes one investment and decides to put all your money into that investment, there's always a risk that that investment might go wrong, which would mean that you've actually lost all your money. So this is why then there are particular ceilings on how much can be put in any asset class at any point in time. So that's really what the purpose of Regulation 28 is. Now, what the ANC seems to be proposing is that they want Regulation 28 to be amended. That's the first part. The second part is the purpose for which they want Regulation 28 to be amended, and they say that they want it to be able to enable cheaper access to finance. Now, that is quite problematic because, firstly, when they say that they want and Regulation 28, it's still not particularly clear what it is that they want to amend. Some people have suggested that they want to be able to say to our pension fund managers that you must invest in these particular projects because the government has said so. Now, that is particularly dangerous and risky because if I'm going to retire next year, I want my pensions to be invested in the best performing asset classes that are available in the market rather than what the government prefers for people to invest in. So that's the first part. And the second part is that when they then say that it's because they want to enable cheaper access to finance, they seem to imply that these types of investments would otherwise ordinarily be rejected by your pension fund manager because he would simply be saying, well, actually, I'd rather invest your money in asset class A because it offers better returns. But this amendment is then trying to then say to him, well, never mind that the better returns are in asset class A, please put the money in asset class B because the government wants it to be so. That is highly dangerous, and until we actually see exactly what it is that they want to put through as an amendment, we have to be very skeptical about them simply saying amend Regulation 28 because the consequences of that are problematic, particularly for people whose money is actually being held by these various pension fund managers.
Being skeptical is one thing, Khaya, but is it necessarily a bad idea to use pension funds to invest in these infrastructure projects?
Not necessarily, unless, of course, you're speaking to someone whose money is the one that's being used here. And we always have to be able to consider what exactly the long-term and the short-term consequences are. So in the short term, if it turns out that these infrastructure projects are the type of infrastructure projects that take forever to generate a return, in other words, you invest in it now, but it will take 10 or 15 years for you to get a particular return, that is problematic for somebody who's going to retire long before this investment starts generating a return, because it will mean that at the point in time when they say, actually, I'm done with work, can I have my pension? their pension balance would be adversely affected by the fact that a part of it has been invested in an asset that is still not at the point at generating good returns at that point in time. So that's the risk that an individual pension fund member would be facing. But I think in the bigger scheme of things, it is something that has been considered elsewhere in the world, that actually pension funds, given their longer term risk investment horizon, because a lot of pension funds aren't really trying to invest today and withdraw the money tomorrow. It is really a much longer investment horizon. So of course, they are the ones whose investment horizon is more closely aligned with the longer term nature of the type of infrastructure projects that we are seeing in the ANC economic policy proposal, for example.
So, Mr. Godongwana spoke about proposals and, of course, some of the money that has been pledged by some of the international finance institutions to fund some of these infrastructure development programs. But, and I was reminding him about this as well, you might remember the 2010 New Growth Path. It suggested as an economic policy led by then President Zuma, very much the same that is being proposed right now. But we are now in 2010. It is 10 years later, and we haven't seen any of those proposals making any great strides. We haven't made a dent in our unemployment. We haven't, for example, seen any significant economic growth. So this paper makes some of those very same proposals in the very same areas that the NGP document made. What should we make of this? Is government out of ideas?
Well, I don't think we can accuse the Economic Transformation Subcommittee of being the type of visionaries that come up with new ideas as issues evolve. If you do look at this document, it is indeed a replica of things that we've heard before and things that we've seen before. What this document still fails to engage with is a substantive question of why any of these ideas essentially go to government and actually die there. And I think the way that they've tried to get around it is that they do acknowledge that you need to strengthen South Africa's presidency so that whatever it is that they propose actually does get implemented. Now, I think the bigger risk that we always face here is that if you look at the proposal on a standalone basis and you do not look at what's been written before and what's been done before, and if you do not look at the government's track record in performance, you could say that, look, this is a credible document. It makes particular sense. There are some of the sectors that are identified that we all agree. These are high labor absorption sectors, so of course we should be investing in them. But what we're not dealing with in the elephant in the room, that even last year, its own cabinet minister, being Victor Mboweni, put the document together and the government simply ignored it. Now, can you imagine what it's like for an outside structure, which is a political party, to then make up a particular proposal and assume that that one is going to get implemented when even government's own self-initiative proposals can simply be roundly ignored on the basis that implementation remains the fundamental business of this government. So it's quite ambitious, but how they're going to imagine this will happen when its own cabinet ministers are happy to ignore their own proposals still remains a mystery for me.
And what about the gap between policy and reality, that disjuncture between policy and state capacity, Khaya?
Look, I mean, if you read this particular document, it says this is what we ought to do, but also doesn't go into enough detail to explain the reality that we're probably not going to be able to finance this unless we change the way we manage public finances. So some of the statements that I use them are very, very vague statements in that it says we must leverage, macroeconomic policy tools to align them with whatever it is that we want to achieve. But this is the type of document where you would have assumed that they would identify exactly what those macroeconomic policy instruments that they want to leverage are going to be. Because one particular obsession that has always been then was the fact that the Reserve Bank needs to do something and the Reserve Bank needs to do more. Well, this is the type of policy document that should now explicitly tell us exactly what it is that the ANC expects the Reserve Bank to do. But unfortunately, the highlight of the Reserve Bank conversation is on the question of ownership. And when Enoch Godongwana says, yes, we must do full ownership, but without benefiting the private shareholders who are currently shareholders, that's a meaningless argument in the context of what you're trying to achieve. You could do that tomorrow, but you still wouldn't have dealt with the underlying issues purposes of what we're trying to achieve as a country. So that, for me, is still the ongoing problem here. And I think also when we look at the question of financing, they do now say that, well, we need to be able to look into public and private partnerships in order to be able to make this happen. The problem is not that the private sector doesn't have the money. The problem is that the private sector doesn't have a license to partner with the government that is so weak when it comes to actual policy implementation. It is difficult to go and motivate for anyone to partner into a financing arrangement with the state when the state will eventually change its mind overnight without explaining what the basis for the change in policy or decision-making is. So it's really a self-defeating conversation when the government doesn't acknowledge exactly the role that it's played in crippling the investment appetite in the country over a long period of time.
And in moving forward, we obviously need to reconceptualize growth in this country. If you were to give government some pointers, some advice in this regard, where should they start?
So the one interesting thing that this document tends to do is that it harps back to what the ANC regards as the glory days of GEAR, which was the growth, employment and redistribution strategy of the middle 1990s. And I think the key issue that the government missed back then and is also missing now is that the reason that that growth was so skewed towards the top, was so concentrated toward the smaller part of the population, is that not enough work was done at the grassroots level to ensure that the people who start off with a very low skills base can be absorbed permanently in whatever economic conversation that you're putting it there. And of course, we know that the long-term multiplier effect of education is something that is priceless. So if people are not only given the first job opportunity, but also the ability to skill and upskill and reskill themselves as the job market evolves, that has a much better outcome on individuals, on employment data, than simply saying we're going to hire you in a labor-intensive market when that market itself may be subject to external factors that you cannot control. So I still think, for me, that the ANC underestimates the impact not just of traditional education, but also workplace-based education as the one leverage that enables people to remain within the employment world, to remain within the workforce, regardless of the externalities that might affect a particular sector or a particular industry. So, for example, they speak a lot about tourism to say this is the one sector that we need to focus on. Nobody can dispute that. But remember, that is a sector that is subject to the fluctuations that absolutely nobody within the country can control. As you can see, even now during the COVID-19 crisis, that sector has been decimated by factors that absolutely nobody could have foreseen. So, of course, you want to then ask the question of, if we do invest in that sector, how do we ensure that should another exogenous shock happen to the sector, the people that work within the sector are able to transition into alternative job opportunities? And the ANC quite simply still hasn't mastered that part of the question.
Khaya Sithole, thanks for your time. Political analyst and chartered accountant Khaya Sithole commenting on the ANC's proposed economic interventions to achieve growth and inclusive economy. So we'll park that there. We're going to take a quick break, and then on the other side of that,